In the quiet, affluent suburb of Lakeview, nestled along the shores of Lake Michigan, a chilling event shattered the peaceful night. On October 15, 2024, at approximately 1:17 a.m., the stillness was abruptly broken by the sharp crack of a gunshot. Margaret Woodward, 53, jolted awake in her bed, her heart racing. Confused and frightened, she called out for her husband, Richard, but received no response. With growing dread, Margaret made her way downstairs, calling Richard's name. As she approached his study, she noticed a sliver of light beneath the door. Trembling, she pushed it open, only to be confronted by a scene that would haunt her for the rest of her life. There, in his favorite leather armchair, sat Richard Woodward, 55, slumped motionless. A Glock 19 lay on the floor beside him, and a single gunshot wound to his right temple marred his otherwise serene expression. The acrid smell of gunpowder still hung in the air, mixing with the familiar scent of Richard's favorite bourbon. The initial 911 call, made by Margaret, was filled with shock and disbelief. First responders arrived on the scene within minutes, but it was already too late. Richard Woodward, a prominent figure in Lakeview's business community, was pronounced dead. Detective Victoria Baxter entered the study where Richard Woodward's body remained undisturbed. The scene bore all the hallmarks of a typical suicide. The gun was registered to Richard, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle in the meticulously maintained home. A half-empty tumbler of bourbon sat on the side table, suggesting Woodward might have been drinking before taking his own life. A note, written in what appeared to be Richard's handwriting, lay on his desk. It read simply, "I'm sorry. I couldn't bear it anymore. Please forgive me." However, as Detective Baxter would soon discover, nothing about this case was as straightforward as it seemed. Richard Woodward was more than just another suburban businessman. He was part of Woodward Industries, a manufacturing empire that had been the backbone of Lakeview's economy for over 5 decades. Founded in 1972 by Richard's father, George Woodward Sr., the company had grown from a small machine shop into a multi-million-dollar enterprise specializing in precision parts for the automotive industries. As investigators delved deeper into the Woodward family history, a complex web of relationships and rivalries began to emerge. Richard was not the only Woodward involved in the family business. His older brother, George Woodward Jr., had long been considered the golden child of the family. Where Richard was introverted and methodical, George Jr. was charismatic and ambitious. He drove a red Lamborghini Aventador, lived in a sprawling mansion overlooking Lake Michigan, and was a fixture in local society pages. The brothers' divergent paths had come to a head 5 years earlier, when George Woodward Sr., now in his early 80s, had to choose a successor to lead the company. To the surprise of few in Lakeview's business circles, he had selected George Jr. to take the reins as CEO. Richard, despite his years of dedicated service and intimate knowledge of the company's operations, was relegated to the role of Senior Operations Manager, a title that many saw as a consolation prize. As the initial shock of Richard's death began to wear off, Detective Baxter and her team started to piece together the events leading up to that fateful morning. Interviews with family members, friends, and colleagues painted a picture of a man who had been struggling with his place in the family and the company. Margaret Woodward, still visibly shaken, told investigators that Richard had been distant in recent months. He would spend hours in his study, just staring at old family photos, she said. When I asked what was wrong, he'd just shake his head and say it was business stuff. I should have pushed harder. Maybe if I had. George Woodward Jr. reached at his office in downtown Lakeview, expressed shock and grief at his brother's death. Richard was the backbone of this company, he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sure, we had our differences, but he was my brother. I can't believe he would do this. But as Detective Baxter and her team dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge that suggested Richard Woodward's death might not have been a suicide after all. The autopsy, conducted by Dr. James Morrison of the Lakeview Medical Examiner's Office, revealed several surprising details. While the cause of death was indeed a single gunshot wound to the head, Dr. Morrison found trace amounts of a powerful sedative in Richard's system, a drug for which he had no prescription. Toxicology reports indicated that the concentration was high enough to have significantly impaired his motor functions and decision-making abilities. Given the levels of this sedative in Mr. Woodward's system, Dr. Morrison noted in his report, it's highly unlikely he would have had the coordination necessary to operate a firearm with any degree of accuracy. Furthermore, gunshot residue tests yielded unexpected results. While residue was found on Richard's right hand, consistent with him firing the weapon, trace amounts were also detected on the cuffs of his dress shirt, in patterns that forensic experts deemed inconsistent with suicide. The suicide note, too, began to raise questions. Graphology experts noted subtle inconsistencies in the handwriting, suggesting that while it was indeed Richard's hand that wrote the note, he may have been under duress or significantly impaired at the time. As the investigation progressed, Detective Baxter identified two primary suspects, each with potential motives for wanting Richard Woodward dead. The first was George Woodward Jr., Richard's older brother and CEO of Woodward Industries. Initial interviews with company employees revealed a tense relationship between the brothers in the weeks leading up to Richard's death. Several workers reported overhearing heated arguments, often centered around the company's financial state and future direction. A deeper look into Woodward Industries' finances revealed that the company had been struggling more than publicly acknowledged. There were rumors of impending layoffs, and some speculated that Richard, with his comprehensive understanding of the company's operations, might have been planning to expose questionable business practices. George Jr. vehemently denied any involvement in his brother's death, providing an alibi that he was at a business dinner on the night in question. However, security camera footage from the restaurant showed him leaving earlier than he had claimed, opening up a window of opportunity for him to have been involved in Richard's death. The second suspect was Margaret Woodward herself. While initially appearing distraught, her behavior in the days following Richard's death raised eyebrows among the investigators. She seemed unusually interested in the details of Richard's life insurance policy and was overheard discussing future travel plans with a friend barely a week after the funeral. Further investigation revealed that Margaret had a secret of her own, a young lover who worked as a personal trainer at her gym. Text messages between the two suggested they had been planning a future together, but Richard's life insurance policy was key to their plans. As the investigation entered its third week, Detective Baxter found herself at a crossroads. Both George Jr. and Margaret had potential motives and questionable alibis, but there wasn't enough evidence to conclusively tie either of them to the crime. The gun had been wiped clean of prints, and the home security system had been deactivated on the night of Richard's death, a detail that Margaret claimed was due to a routine system update. It was then that a new piece of evidence emerged, one that would turn the entire investigation on its head. Cody Woodward, Richard and Margaret's 20-year-old son, had been away at college when his father died. He returned home for the funeral, appearing appropriately grief-stricken and supportive of his mother. But as Detective Baxter reviewed security camera footage from neighboring houses, she noticed something odd. On the night of Richard's death, a figure matching Cody's description was seen entering the Woodward home at 11:23 p.m., hours after Cody had claimed to be back at his college dorm. The figure left again at 1:17 a.m., just hours before Margaret discovered Richard's body. When confronted with this evidence, Cody's carefully constructed alibi began to crumble. Under intense questioning, he finally broke down and confessed to a truth far more shocking than anyone could have imagined. 20 years ago, Margaret Woodward had engaged in a passionate affair with her brother-in-law, George Jr. The affair resulted in a pregnancy, a secret that threatened to tear the family apart. However, it wasn't just Margaret who carried this burden. George Jr., torn between his ambition and his unborn child, was also privy to this life-altering information. In a decision that would haunt them for decades, Margaret's father-in-law, the family patriarch George Woodward Sr., discovered the affair and the pregnancy. Using his influence and the threat of disinheritance, he forced Margaret and George Jr. to end their relationship and keep the pregnancy a secret. Margaret would carry the child to term, and Richard would be led to believe the baby was his own. For 15 years, this fragile facade held. Cody grew up believing Richard was his father, while Margaret and George Jr. maintained a cool, distant relationship in public. But fate had other plans. On a spring afternoon 5 years ago, 15-year-old Cody returned home early from school, feeling unwell. As he entered the house, he heard muffled sounds coming from his parents' bedroom. Curious and concerned, he quietly made his way upstairs, only to push open the door and find his mother in a passionate embrace with his uncle George Jr. The discovery of his true parentage had shattered Cody's world. In the emotional aftermath, Margaret and George Jr., realizing they could no longer hide the truth, had revealed everything to Cody. They explained the affair, the pregnancy, and the years of deception that followed. This revelation fundamentally altered Cody's relationship with the man he had always believed to be his father. From that day forward, Cody became increasingly distant from Richard. He spent more time with George Jr., eager to forge a connection with his biological father. Richard, unaware of the truth, was left confused and hurt by his son's apparent rejection. As the years passed, Cody's resentment towards Richard grew. He saw Richard as a weak man who had been easily deceived, a stark contrast to the powerful and charismatic George Jr. This bitterness festered, creating a toxic undercurrent in the Woodward household. On the morning of October 12, 2024, Richard had returned home unexpectedly, having forgotten some important documents for an early morning meeting. As he approached the house, he saw George's car parked down the street, an unusual sight at that early hour. Curious and concerned, Richard quietly entered the house, only to overhear a conversation that would shatter his world. From the shadows of the hallway, he heard Cody's voice, filled with bitterness and resentment. "When can I finally call you my father openly? It's a shame to be known as the son of such a loser." George's response came with a chuckle, his tone casual and dismissive. "When he hangs up his skates, relax. I'll buy you a car for your 21st, and we'll say it's from your granddad. That way Richard won't catch on." That conversation, while meant as a joke by George, planted a seed in Cody's mind. As he drove back to his college dormitory that afternoon, a dark and twisted plan began to take shape. The casual way George had spoken about Richard's death, combined with years of resentment and a burning desire to claim his true father openly, pushed Cody over an edge he didn't even know existed. Over the next 3 days, alone in his dorm room, Cody's idea crystallized into a full-fledged plan. He would kill Richard and make it look like suicide. The thought both terrified and exhilarated him. It was the ultimate solution to all his problems. No more pretending, no more living a lie. And with Richard gone, he could finally have the relationship he craved with George. Cody knew his father's habits well. Richard was a creature of routine, often spending late evenings in his favorite chair in the study, reviewing documents or simply sitting with a glass of scotch. It was there that Cody decided he would strike. As the days passed, Cody meticulously planned every detail. He acquired the necessary materials, rehearsed his alibi, and steeled his resolve. Finally, on the night of October 15th, Cody put his plan into action. That night, under the cover of darkness, Cody drove back to the family home. He parked a block away and approached the house on foot, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and twisted anticipation. Using his key, he silently entered the house. Just as he had predicted, Cody found Richard in his study, slumped in his chair. The room was dimly lit by a single desk lamp, casting long shadows across the floor. Richard appeared to be dozing, an empty glass on the side table next to him. For a moment, Cody hesitated. The sight of Richard, vulnerable and unaware, made the reality of what he was about to do crash down upon him. But then he remembered the years of feeling like an outsider in his own family, the bitter resentment of living a lie, and George's laughing promise of a future where he could openly call him father. With these thoughts fueling him, Cody steeled himself and stepped into the room, ready to set his deadly plan in motion. Unbeknownst to Cody, Richard had not been sleeping peacefully in his chair. After the shocking revelation earlier that day, Richard had retreated to his study, his mind reeling from the betrayal he had uncovered. He had poured himself a glass of scotch, then another, as he grappled with the harsh truth of his family's deception. What should he do? Confront Margaret about her infidelity? Face George and demand an explanation? Or perhaps he should simply pack a bag and leave, turning his back on the lies and pain that now tainted every memory of his family life. The weight of these decisions, combined with the alcohol and emotional exhaustion, had finally pulled Richard into a fitful sleep. It was in this vulnerable state that Cody found his father. Richard's brow was furrowed even in sleep, as if his troubled thoughts refused to leave him even in unconsciousness. Cody paused for a moment, studying the man he had once called father. A flicker of doubt crossed his mind, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had come too far to turn back now. Moving with quiet determination, Cody first placed a folded piece of paper on the desk near Richard. The note, carefully crafted to mimic Richard's handwriting, spoke of unbearable shame, financial troubles, and a desire to free his family from his failures. It was the cornerstone of Cody's plan to make this look like a suicide. Next, Cody reached into his jacket and pulled out the revolver he had taken from Richard's gun safe earlier. He had worn gloves to avoid leaving prints, thinking through every detail to avoid suspicion. The gunshot was deafening in the quiet of the night. Richard never woke, never knew what hit him. One moment he was lost in troubled dreams, the next, nothing. Cody stood frozen for a moment, the reality of what he had just done crashing over him. The acrid smell of gunpowder filled the air, mixing with the lingering scent of Richard's favorite scotch. Snapping out of his daze, Cody quickly placed the gun in Richard's limp hand, positioning it to support the illusion of suicide. He gave one last look around the room, ensuring everything was as he had planned. He had then left the house, driving aimlessly for hours before returning to his college dorm, where he fabricated an alibi with the help of his roommate. The revelation of Cody's involvement and the tangled web of family secrets sent shockwaves through the community of Lakeview. The arrest of Cody Woodward on charges of manslaughter and obstruction of justice was front-page news, but it was only the beginning of the scandal that would engulf the Woodward family. Margaret Woodward, already grappling with the loss of her husband, now faced public scrutiny for her decades-long deception. Her affair with George Jr. and the subsequent cover-up became the subject of intense media speculation and community gossip. George Woodward Jr., while cleared of direct involvement in his brother's death, saw his reputation tarnished by the revelation of his affair with Margaret and his secret meetings with Cody. The scandal threatened to derail Woodward Industries as shareholders and business partners began to question the integrity of the company's leadership. For Detective Victoria Baxter, the case was a stark reminder of the complexities that lay beneath the surface of even the most seemingly perfect families. "In all my years on the force," she would later remark, "I've never seen a case where the truth was more twisted than any lie we could have imagined." The trial of Cody Woodward began 6 months after Richard's death, capturing national attention. The prosecution painted a picture of a resentful young man who, upon discovering his true parentage, had lashed out in anger, leading to his father's death. They emphasized the calculated nature of Cody's actions in staging the scene and maintaining his deception for weeks. The defense, led by prominent attorney, argued that Cody was a victim of circumstances beyond his control. They portrayed him as a young man shattered by the revelation of his true parentage, acting out of confusion and years of subconscious resentment. The fatal shot, they contended, was a tragic accident in the heat of an emotional confrontation. As the trial progressed, the dark underbelly of the Woodward family was exposed for all to see. Margaret took the stand, tearfully recounting her affair with George Jr. and the years of guilt she had carried. George Jr. testified about his secret meetings with Cody, expressing remorse for the pain his actions had caused. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury found Cody guilty of manslaughter, but not of premeditated murder. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 10 years. 5 years after, Cody Woodward, now 25, sat alone in his prison cell, the weight of his actions heavy on his shoulders. The reality of his situation was a far cry from the future he had imagined on that fateful night. The promised car for his 21st birthday, the open acknowledgement of George as his father, the life of luxury and respect, all of it had evaporated like morning dew under the harsh light of his crimes. George Woodward Jr., the man Cody had once idolized and killed for, had cut all ties with his biological son. In the immediate aftermath of the trial, George had attempted to distance himself from the scandal, issuing a statement expressing shock and dismay at Cody's actions. As the years passed, that distance had calcified into complete abandonment. The last Cody had heard, George had moved overseas, attempting to rebuild some semblance of a business career far from the shadow of the Woodward name. The only visitor Cody received with any regularity was his mother, Margaret. Once a fixture of high society, Margaret now lived a life worlds away from her former luxury. The Woodward family, led by a vengeful George Sr., had cut her off entirely from the family fortune. She now resided in a small trailer on the outskirts of town, struggling to make ends meet with a series of part-time jobs. Every month, Margaret would make the long journey to the prison, her face a little more lined, her clothes a little more worn each time. During these visits, mother and son would sit across from each other, separated by glass and years of secrets and regrets. They would talk of mundane things, the weather, books Cody had read, Margaret's latest job woes, carefully avoiding the elephant in the room, the night that had destroyed their lives. For Cody, these visits were a lifeline, a reminder of the world beyond the prison walls, but they were also a source of gnawing guilt. He saw the toll his actions had taken on his mother, the once proud woman now humbled by poverty and shame. In his darkest moments, alone in his cell, Cody wondered if any of it had been worth it. The Woodward Industries building, once the crown jewel of the local business district, now stood empty, a silent testament to the family's fall. The company had been sold off in pieces in the wake of the scandal, its assets stripped and its workforce scattered to the winds. The town that had once thrived under the Woodward family's patronage now struggled with unemployment and a tarnished reputation. As for the justice system, the case had left its mark. The trial of Cody Woodward was now a case study in law schools across the country, examining the complex interplay of family dynamics, hidden paternity, and the fine line between manslaughter and premeditated murder. Detective Victoria Baxter, who had led the investigation, had been promoted and was now a sought-after speaker on complex family homicides. In the end, the Woodward case served as a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the mightiest can fall, that secrets have a way of surfacing, and that the consequences of our actions can echo far beyond what we ever imagined. As Cody Woodward waited out his sentence, the words he had spoken to George on that fateful night echoed in his mind. "When can I finally call you my father?" The bitter irony was that in trying to claim one father, he had lost them both, and so much more. The tragedy of the Woodward family would be remembered for years to come, a modern-day Greek tragedy played out in the heart of American suburbia. And in a small prison cell, Cody Woodward continued to grapple with the weight of his choices, the once promising scion of a powerful family, now nothing more than a cautionary footnote in the annals of true crime history.